at the attributes of God. This will be part 5 of the omnipotence of God, which is His ability to act, His ability to produce effect. His omnipotence, of course, is His sovereignty. If He's sovereign, He has to be omnipotent. If He is not sovereign, then He is not omnipotent. So again, to deny His sovereignty is to deny His godhood, is to deny who He is. His sovereignty, of course, speaks of His control, His rule, His dominance over all things. And that coincides, necessitates omnipotence. We've seen thus far that omnipotence is declared throughout the Scriptures by general statements. It's declared and implied by His various names. The name Almighty, of course, declares His omnipotence. And then it is implied in other names such as Lord of Hosts, etc. It's also illustrated by His miraculous works. All the miracles in the Bible are just illustrations of the omnipotence of God. It is seen in His sustaining of creation, and it is seen very clearly and illustrated very clearly in redemption or in salvation. As we saw last week, and this is important that we grasp this, His omnipotence can be divided into two parts. There is what we would call His absolute omnipotence, and that is simply what He can do, what God can do. And we've seen that God can do everything except that which is contrary to His nature, because then He would have to cease to be God. For example, God cannot lie. He would have to deny Himself. But His absolute omnipotence is what God can do. Not what He will do, but what He can do. And then the other portion would be His ordinate, which is what He does, what God does. Again, by way of review, if we go over to Matthew chapter 3, Matthew 3 and verse 9. Matthew 3 and verse 9. Notice about halfway through, I say unto you that God is able of these stones, pointing to some stones, obviously, to raise up children unto Abraham. Now, is He going to do that? No. Can He do that? Yes. So that's the absolute power of God. Then in Matthew 26, verses 53 and 54. This is Jesus speaking, thinkest thou that I cannot now pray to my Father, and He shall presently give me more than 12 legions of angels? Okay, it's the absolute power of God. Christ could do that. He has the ability to do that. Wasn't going to, because then He would have to be unfaithful. In verse 54, but how then shall the Scriptures be fulfilled that it must be? So here you have the absolute and the ordinate power of God. What God can do, what God will do. We've also seen that His power is infinite. again, he can do everything in accord with his nature. He cannot deny himself. His power is independent. Now, that goes without saying. If he's omnipotent, then he cannot be dependent upon another source that would deny his omnipotence. So, omnipotence of necessity not only demands sovereignty, or sovereignty demands omnipotence, but omnipotence of necessity demands independence. God doesn't derive anything from any other source than himself. If he was dependent upon someone else, they would be more powerful than him. So his omnipotence is independent. His omnipotence, of course, is invincible. If it can be defeated, then it's not omnipotent. Again, this is just common sense. And none can prevent him. If you can prevent God from doing what he has determined to do, then that makes you more powerful than God. Then he's not omnipotent. So, again, people in their statement of faith, they'll say, we believe God is omnipotent, but you read on further, no, they don't. they don't believe anything about God, because their other doctrines contradict. What they say they believe up here is contradicted down here. So, again, all these things work together. His power is invincible. None can prevent him. He's incapable of being conquered. His will is incapable of being conquered, incapable of being overcome, incapable of being subdued. He is immense. He is superior to all. And that must be so if God is omnipotent. So that brings us to the omnipotence of God, of course, is inexhaustible. And it has to be. Again, omnipotence necessitates the fact that it cannot be exhausted. There's no limit. It cannot run out. It is from everlasting to everlasting. In other words, it's always been and will always be. In Psalm 102, if we turn there, Psalm 102, verse 25, they, referring back to the work of thy hands, creation, they shall perish. They shall perish. But thou, okay, a contrast is being drawn, but thou shalt endure. His omnipotence shall endure as well. Yea, all of them, the work of thy hands, shall wax old like a garment. That's their nature. That's how he created them. As a vesture shalt thou change them. And they shall all, again, and they shall be changed. But, again, a contrast. Thou art the same. Omnipotence is always the same. It cannot increase, or it wasn't omnipotence to begin with. It cannot decrease, then it would cease to be omnipotence. Everything about God, but thou art the same. And thy years shall have no end. He's eternal. The children of thy servants shall continue, and their seed shall be established before thee. Isaiah chapter 40. Isaiah 40, verse 28. Hast thou not known, hast thou not heard, that the everlasting God, the eternal God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, okay, that's his power, fainteth not, neither is weary. There is no searching of his understanding. And that's true of every aspect of God. There is no searching. God is infinite. God is inexhaustible, and that includes His omnipotence. Philippians 3:21, He is able to subdue all things. If there's anything that He is not able to subdue, then He's not omnipotent. He is able to subdue all things to Himself. That is, He is able to bring all things into subjection to Himself. He may not do that right now. He will. The day is coming. But He can. He can subdue all things, bring all things in subjection to Himself. The omnipotence of God is incomprehensible. We cannot comprehend the omnipotence of God. In Job chapter 26, Job 26 and verse 14. Before verse 14, talks about many things, such as He divideth the sea with His power in verse 12. By His understandeth He smiteth through the proud. By His Spirit He hath garnished the heavens. His hand hath formed the crooked serpent. And then He says in verse 14, Lo, these are parts of His ways. What God does, and this is where we get into the absolute and the ordinate again, what God does is always only a part of what He can do. It's only a part. It's only a portion. We have never seen all that God can do, nor will we ever see all that God can do. We can't even comprehend the parts. Lo, these are parts of His ways, and we can't comprehend them. But then he goes on, he says, but how little portion is heard of Him. Again, everything we know about God, it's just a little portion. Just a grain of sand in a bucket. That's all it is. Just a little portion. But the thunder of His power, now he's talking about His omnipotence. Who can understand? In other words, it's incomprehensible. So what is recorded of God in His Word, and there's a lot in His Word recorded concerning God, it's only a part of His ways. God dividing the Red Sea. What power? But it's only a part. It's only a part of what God can do. God saving a soul, the greatest miracle there is. Only a part of His way. Notice in Ephesians 1. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 19. And what is the exceeding greatness of His power to us who believe, to usward who believe? And we believe according to the working of His mighty power. What we want to notice is the exceeding greatness of His power. The exceeding greatness of His power. Greatness. Someone says, His power is great. Yes, it is. But it's much more than that. It exceeds greatness. The exceeding greatness of His power. Take greatness as far as you can take it in your mind, and His power exceeds greatness. That is, it goes beyond greatness. It's incomprehensible. We cannot even begin to understand it. In Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 7, we read there in the last part of the verse, the effectual working of His power. The effectual working of His power. It's effective. His power is effective. He does not put forth His power and it fails. It's the effectual working of His power. He is a God who exceeds in power. Notice Ephesians 3, verse 20. Wonderful verse. Now unto Him that is able. And you could just stop, put a period there, and think about that the rest of your life. God is able. God is able. He goes on to do. Okay, God is able to do. He's able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that worketh in us. So let's look at this verse. God is, present tense, able. God is able. That statement covers everything. God is able. The word able speaks of His sufficiency. It speaks of His power, His skill, His capability. God is able. God is able. God is capable. And then it goes on to do. Okay, that speaks of His activity. God is able. God has the power. God has the skill. God has the capability to do, to act. To act. And then notice, He begins to describe this. Exceeding. Exceeding. So His power to do is exceeding. That is, it goes beyond. It goes beyond. Then there's another word. Abundantly. Abundantly. Exceeding abundantly. Those two words are an attempt to express what cannot be expressed. Exceeding abundantly. That which is abundant surpasses, it overflows. So it goes beyond surpassing. It goes beyond overflowing. How do you go beyond overflowing? But that's His power to do is exceeding abundantly, and then you have the word above or over. Over. So His power is exceeding abundantly above, over all, which speaks of the whole, speaks of any or whatever. And then this is described, all that we ask or think. So Paul is saying, you take the greatest measure of God's power that you can think of, that your mind can think of. Just focus upon that. The greatest measure of God's power that your mind can think about. It could be something in creation, outer space, whatever, the Grand Canyon. God, the greatest measure of God's power that we can think of. Keep in mind that whatever that is, it's only a part. It's only a very small part of His power. So you take the greatest measure of God's power that you can think of. And His power is more than that. His power is not only more, but it's exceeding abundantly more. So you can say, well, how much more is it? Well, it's exceeding. Oh, it's abundant. It's exceeding abundant. And it's over all that we can ask or think. You cannot ask God for too much, because He can do exceeding abundantly above all, whether we think it or ask it. It doesn't matter. In other words, it cannot be comprehended, the power of God. So, what God is able to do exceeds in abundance anything we can possibly ask, anything we can possibly think. So God is able exceedingly and abundantly beyond all. That's omnipotence. You can't really define omnipotence. It means all power, of course, but we cannot grasp that, because everything we know in our life, whatever power it has, it's limited. It's within bounds. But God is omnipotent. So again, God is able. God is able. What does that mean? Well, it means that God can. God can. But it's more than that. He can exceedingly. He can abundantly. He can above all. So it's more than just God can. He can to the degree that we cannot comprehend it. The God who rolled back the Red Sea and brought Israel over on dry ground, and the God who fed Israel with bread from heaven, and the God who brought water from the rock, and the God who led Israel through the wilderness, He is able. Yes, He's able to do all of those things again, but He's able exceeding abundantly above. He can do much more than that. The God who brought down the walls of Jericho, the God who gave victory to Gideon and his 300 men, the God who enabled David to defeat Goliath, is able. He's an able God because He's omnipotent. He's able because He's God. He's omnipotent because He's God. The God who increased the widow woman's oil can still do that. The God who delivered from captivity. The God who walked victoriously with the 3 Hebrews in the fiery furnace. That God is able. He is God. And because He is God, He is able. Because He is God, He still can. And He can still do so beyond what we think or ask. He can exceedingly and abundantly above all work. So you take our needs, our burdens, our trials, our difficulties, and yes, they can appear to be overwhelming. They can appear to be unending, but God is able to do exceeding abundantly beyond all of those things. There are battles, there are struggles that appear unwinnable, and there are fears that appear, or foes, enemies that appear unstoppable. There are obstacles, there are challenges that appear to be insurmountable, but God is able. Don't limit God by whatever obstacles or challenges might be in our lives. God is able to do exceeding abundantly above all. He's able to, His power far exceeds all of these things. There are problems that are absolutely beyond the solution of man. Man can't solve them. They're unsolvable. But God is able. There are enemy fortifications that cannot be penetrated by man. And there are wildernesses that we walk through that appear to be endless. But God is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we think or ask. God is able. God is able. Psalm 62, verse 11, power belongeth unto God. And again, that power belongeth unto God. That's absolute. That's the absolute power of God. Belongs to God. It's His. And it's His because He is God. We read in Psalm 93 and verse 4, mightier than. That's true about everything. You put whatever you want on the other side of than. God is mightier than. That's omnipotence. But just like the children of Israel in the wilderness, they limited God. They asked, can God furnish a table in the wilderness? They were limiting God in their minds. We do the same thing. We do the same thing to varying degrees. So in Luke chapter 1, and we've preached upon this not too long ago. Luke chapter 1, might have been a year, might have been 2 years, 3 years, I don't know. Luke chapter 1, verse 30 through verse 35. The angel said unto her, fear not, Mary, for, here's the reason you should not fear. Thou hast found favor with God. And behold, thou shalt conceive in thy womb, and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. He shall be great, shall be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord shall give unto him the throne of his father David. And he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there shall be no end. So this was the promise of God to Mary. Then said Mary, here's her response. Not much unlike our response would be. Then said Mary unto the angel, how shall this be? This don't make sense. How shall this be? Seeing, and now she presents the problem. And the word seen has the same idea as since. So how, seeing or since, I know not a man. Lord, I've heard the promise, but there's a problem here. This can't be. And the angel, now we have the Lord's response, answered and said unto her, the Holy Ghost shall come upon thee. So what is the answer to the how and the since? God. God's the answer. And the power of the highest shall. 2 times in verse 35 you have the word shall, something referring to God. The power of the highest shall overshadow thee. Mary asks, how? We do the same thing. God says, trust me, this is what's going to happen. We say, well, how's that going to happen? God. And then we present the problem. We present the obstacle. In Mary's case, since I know not a man. Lord, you say this, but here's 25 obstacles. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. God's power is the answer. The power of the highest shall overshadow thee. Therefore, also, that holy thing which shall be born of thee shall be called the Son of God. God's omnipotence. We cannot grasp it, but oh, that we would grasp the truth of it. The omnipotence of God. Our problems are so puny in light of God's power. In light of God's power. God is able. God is able. We need to know that. We can't fully understand it. We need to know it. We need to embrace it. God can. God can. Therefore, if we know that, we embrace it. You know, people will say all the time, well, I know God can, but. Okay, now you're going to explain why He can't. Why don't you just be honest and say, I know God can, but I want to tell you why He can't. Because that's what that word but means. You need to depend on Him. Just depend on Him. Well, how do you know God can? Because He's God. That's the only explanation. Because He's God. Be persuaded in that. Be persuaded in Him. Trust Him. Look to Him. Cast all upon Him. Oh, how much different our life would be if we lived in the reality of the omnipotence. The omnipotence of God. Next week we'll begin to look at the grace and the mercy of God. Let's look to the Lord. Heavenly Father, again, we